they were always saying they're only targeting Hamas and everybody else is a casualty. Well, if those guys are just unarmed civilians and they're walking alone, that's what they appear to be.
Dresden.
And you just blast them from the sky with robots.
This is the tragedy of war.
Yeah, this is insane. And no one knows what to think now, because if you can't talk about that, if you can't say that's real, then you're saying that genocide is okay as long as we're doing it. And
that is what we're saying.
And if you're saying that from a perspective of someone who literally went through the Holocaust.
You just heard that correctly. Joe Rogan described Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide during a recent episode of his podcast. Now, he was joined by comedian Kurt Metzger for that conversation, which focused pretty heavily on the war. So without further ado, let's hear more of what they had to say.
The thing that drives me the most crazy when people talk about, well, Hamas is doing this and Hamas doing that. These people, they voted in Hamas. Like, these people are the poorest of poor, deprived of sanitation, education, proper hospital care, food. What the are you talking about? How are they going to rise up? Just run out and get shot en masse until the Hamas runs out of bullets, and then you bludgeon them to death with rocks? What are you saying?
The voting for Hamas, by the way, they forced a vote there. They're like, you have to have a democratic process. And then they voted for Hamas the same way Fatah became a party. So that they voted, then they go, you voted wrong. We're putting you in a concentration camp.
That vote, by the way, happened back in 2006. And I just want to remind the audience that half the population in Gaza is under the age of 18. So the majority of people living in Gaza did not, in fact, cast a ballot or vote for Hamas. But nonetheless, you have the Israeli government using the same excuse, the same argument that, well, they elected in Hamas, we consider them a terrorist group. What they carried out on October 7th, the atrocities that they carried out, gives us the necessary excuse to carry out the brutalities that we're carrying out in Gaza. So be on your way. That's mostly the messaging that we've been getting from Israel's far-right government. And I just feel like every excuse that they've given us can easily be debunked. Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, so we had no choice but to drop bombs on said civilians. Well, they've been using that excuse for forever. I mean, not just during this current war, but in previous wars that Israel has had in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. They always find some sort of excuse about how terrorists are using civilians as human shields. You would think that at this point, Hamas would be under the impression that Israel doesn't care if they're using civilians as human shields. They're gonna drop the bombs anyway. So I just feel like the argument doesn't really make much sense. The human shields don't work, so why would Hamas keep using Palestinians as human shields? And then also, how do you justify the blockade of humanitarian aid, which is rapidly taking Gaza to a situation in which most of the civilians are gonna face famine? How do you justify destroying 60% of the residential buildings, residential housing units in Gaza? How do you justify that? Could it be that maybe Israel wants to just completely raze Gaza, flatten it, destroy all of its infrastructure and push Palestinians out of that land, out of that territory? And I don't really have to guess much about whether the far-right government of Israel wants to do it, because they tell us they want to do it. In fact, Kurt Metzger references that in the next clip. Let's watch.
So what are these Israeli soldiers putting up on TikTok?
Well, all the war crimes that they do.
No.
Look, I
Really?
want to make this clear to everyone. I would never listen to an Arab, okay? So I want you to understand that. I would never believe a Muslim about nothing. You don't have to ever do that. Look at, not America, what they tell you, Israeli news, Israeli politicians, their ambassadors when they come here and talk. Listen to what they say, because that's what I unfortunately did, and it was quite disturbing.
It is quite disturbing. In fact, that's why South Africa had quite a bit to use against Israel's far-right government when they went before the International Criminal Court to argue that Israel's carrying out a genocide, something that the international body says is certainly possible, feasible. So look, some might be surprised at Rogan's statements here, but I'm not surprised at all. I think on this particular topic, Rogan's actually been pretty good. In fact, we had some previous examples that we've covered on the show having to do with Kid Rock's incredibly ignorant statements about the Gaza Strip and about the Palestinian people. If you don't remember what I'm talking about, here's a little refresher.
That's the only thing people understand. This is what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Boom, just wiped out. They're like, oh, yes, we don't have Supreme Leader anymore. We did not know you had such big bombs.
Yeah, but everybody has big bombs now. The problem is you use a big bomb, you set a precedent that they can use a big bomb.
They don't have one.
And later in that conversation, Rogan really did feel the need to offer some defenses for the Palestinian civilians living in the Gaza Strip, which I genuinely appreciate, especially when you consider how gigantic his audience is. Let's watch.
You can't just nuclear bomb people.
I didn't say nuke 'em.
Nuclear bomb you back.
No, I didn't say nuke 'em.
Okay, you said Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I thought you meant it like that.
No, I was saying just the brute force of strength used in those
Yeah, but
conflicts.
even a conventional bombing campaign, if you want to do that somewhere, they can do that to your place.
I'm a peaceful man.
Right, but you're not supposed to pick civilian targets. That's actually a
You
war
can't
crime.
fight war like that. When
But you're not supposed to
they're
pick
hiding in civilian targets.
They are. So that's where like the
They're
Mossad
in
have been able
hospitals.
to
They
get
got
into
trenches underneath. They got operation centers.
They killed those dudes.
And all we can
the
do is
other
go
day.
by the reporting. Like, I get it, but at some point you got to believe something, right?
No, I definitely do. They definitely seem to be doing that. But also, if you're a person who's born in Palestine, you're under their control. It's not your fault. And
By birth.
Yeah, but those aren't our enemy.
No, they're not. They're civilians. And we're supposed to care about protecting civilians. We're supposed to reject BS excuses, shared by a government or a country that continues slaughtering civilians, right? We're supposed to push back against that. Now, look, I give Rogan credit for that, but obviously this is something that is controversial to say in some news organizations, which is why I think for the longest time, you didn't really hear much pushback against whatever Israel was doing, regardless of what government was in charge, regardless of how far right or far left it was. Far left, how funny is that? But this is the reality of the situation. If Israel went in and was careful about protecting civilian lives and specifically engaged in military operations to take out leadership of Hamas, to take out Hamas militants. I'm not an idiot. I know that war is awful. I know that civilians unfortunately die in wars, in every war. So it's not like I'm gonna go after Israel and be super critical if there are some civilian casualties. It's just the reality of war and it's tragic. But guys, 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. And by the way, all the men who have been killed are not all Hamas militants. We know that. The reason why we emphasize the women and children is because the idea that the women and children are the Hamas militants who, committed the atrocities on October 7th is laughable to say the least. But we keep hearing the excuses, people keep buying the excuses, but things are starting to change. And these allegations of anti-Semitism that are only meant to shut the conversation down aren't really working anymore. And when you have the top podcaster in the country speaking out against what's happening, that is a big deal. When you have Joe Rogan referring to what's happening in Gaza as a genocide, that is a big deal. And even if you don't believe at all that what Israel is carrying out is a genocide, you have to at least acknowledge the fact that on the international stage, and even here in the United States, Israel is losing support because of how they are carrying out this war, because of the optics of the war, because of the statements that we've heard from various members of Israel's far-right government. Netanyahu has done great damage to that country, And he continues to do so because he wants to remain in power. He is under the impression that the Israeli people will just, bear him as long as this war is ongoing, which means that he has an interest, a self-interest in continuing this war as long as possible so he can remain in power. I believe that the Israeli people need to oust him as soon as possible. Okay, not for my sake, not for America's sake, but for their sake, for Israel's sake. Because this is the type of leadership that is leading to various countries that are allied with Israel now really questioning whether Israel is the type of ally that gives a damn about human rights, about international laws. That's a terrible place for Israel to be in. And so if they don't change course soon, the dissent will continue to grow. Netanyahu doesn't care about that. All Netanyahu cares about is himself and his ability to remain in power. And I think the people of Israel should really consider what that means for them.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.